A Clockwork Orange is a difficult film for a lot of people. I personally know a number of people who are repulsed by the film, its casual ultra-violence, and especially its humble narrator. But if I were to say that I love A Clockwork Orange, I don't think I would find myself in the minority of the people that have watched it. There's a lot to love in the film. Fantastic score, eye-popping set design, an incredible Malcolm McDowell performance, and Stanley Kubrick working at the height of his power. Granted, a lot of the subject matter is difficult to swallow, but there remains something seductive about A Clockwork Orange, something that's drawn me towards the film time and time again.
It's violence of the mind. I mean, it's not violent. I mean, you see more violence on the news program. You see more violence in a John Wayne film. John Wayne always shoots, and you always feel, oh, good old John Wayne. You know, he's the goodie, and he shot the baddie. It's more violence of the imagination, of the mind.
The violence in A Clockwork Orange was incredibly polarizing for its time. The film was confronted with a controversy immediately upon its release. It subsequently was pulled from circulation in the UK at Kubrick's request upon a spike in supposed copycat killings. Reportedly, the director even received death threats himself. But watching the film with modern eyes, it seems that McDowell may have a point. Compared to the horror films we're used to, there's very little gore and blood in A Clockwork Orange. By today's standards, the so-called ultra-violence is mostly pretty PG-13, and in some instances is kind of cartoonish and wacky. Despite his decision to pull the film, Kubrick himself argued that acts of extreme violence have always been portrayed in mediums of storytelling, from the Bible to the Greek myths to Shakespeare. If violence has always played a pivotal role in humanity and the stories we tell, then the urge to commit violence has been a thread in the human fabric for as long as we've been around. In the opinion of your humble narrator, it's less likely that antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy, and even impulsive violence is spurred by violent films, and more likely that the violent impulses existed already. Yet when we watch a film like A Clockwork Orange that uses a method like narration to place us firmly within a first-person narrative, we can't help but compare and contrast the protagonist to ourselves. We watch Alex beat, torture, and murder, and are forced into having a self-confrontation.
Just say that there's this strange psychological identification with him. It's probably what attracted me to the book, a strange duality of a character who is plainly evil, and yet, because of him operating on this unconscious level, makes you aware of things in your own personality which you then identify with him.
I think the strange identification with Alex that Kubrick spoke about can explain why some people are appalled with the film and why others find themselves coming back to it time and time again. We find a possible clue to that puzzle in Carl Jung's integration of the shadow archetype theory. The shadow, put simply, represents the darker, repressed side of the self, and more often than not, the aspects of ourselves that submerge into our shadows are those traits and attributes generally frowned upon by society at large. This can be something as simple as childhood aggressiveness, or something as complicated as a momentary desire to violence. However, one of the more common shadow traits is that of inherent aggression. A quick glance through history is all you need to be assured that Homo sapiens are a violent species. We may feel comforted knowing that our 21st century morality has emphasized the evil of violence and murder, casting a permanent mark on those heinous enough to still entertain the thought of committing such unspeakable acts. Yet heinous acts are still committed around the world every single day. If the threat of being exiled from society and being locked behind bars by the state isn't enough to completely crush humanity's aggressive instincts, then nothing ever will. The psychoanalyst Clara Thompson wrote, "Aggression is not necessarily destructive at all. It springs from an innate tendency to grow and master life, which seems to be characteristic of all living matter. Only when this life force is obstructed in its development do ingredients of anger, rage, or hate become connected with it." Developing in a society, culture, or household that bunches all forms of childhood aggression into the same deplorable basket, while encouraging no other healthy outlet for said aggression, will undoubtedly breed passive individuals who will grapple with their internal shadows that only fester with age. Unaware that their morality shuns a natural impulse, Their shadows will overwhelm them eventually until it finds an outlet in unchecked rage, contempt, and possibly substance abuse. We see obvious examples of repressed shadows when the film transitions to prison, but how does this relate to Alex exactly? We may speculate that the society in which the film is set is one where prevailing morality takes a firmly disapproving view to the natural aggressive tendency. The fact that roving bands of hoodlums own the streets at night and the prisons are overpopulated may prove that the only outlet for it is through violence. Alex is perhaps the only character in A Clockwork Orange with an integrated shadow. Over-integrated, it's fair to say, but if we concede that his droogs and Billy Boy and his gang also pursue violence as the only means of expressing aggression, then what separates Alex from them? In my view, not only does Alex accept the dark side of his personality, he overindulges in it.
Oh, it was gorgeousness and gorgeosity made flesh. I knew such lovely pictures.
Where the other droogs commit violence rather mindlessly, Alex sees a beauty in it, and judging by the flair he embraces while committing it, may even see it as a kind of art form. A very speculative take, granted, but I think a fair amount of the people who have strong negative reactions to the film and its humble narrator may do so because seeing a character so unhinged from the moral chains that bind the average person unconsciously triggers and overstimulates the repressed aggression instinct. The embedded morality instilled in most of us programs us to be repulsed by such acts. In no way is that a defense of Alex or his actions, because there is no defending it, nor is that to say that you shouldn't feel repulsed by Alex, because rejecting heinous actions committed for pleasure is objectively righteous. However, I do believe it is of value to gather a deeper understanding of the matter, and if we are sickened by Alex, to explore why exactly that is. By the same token, I believe the concept of the shadow also explains why many are drawn to the film. As I stated before, Alex has an integrated shadow. In other words, he is one with the self, a true individual. Again, perhaps the only one in the film. No matter how reprehensible his moral code, being unshakably oneself is an admirable trait. Alex is sophisticated, he enjoys culture, he has an unwavering love of Beethoven, and is articulate enough to create his own dialect of English and Russian. Alex is a despicable person, yes, but his sophistication gives him a flair that the other droogs and scoundrels of the night simply don't have. It's exactly that flair and intense love of Beethoven that leads to the incident inciting Georgie and Dim's coup against him, ultimately landing Alex in the slammer. A process of depersonalization commences immediately upon Alex's imprisonment. He loses his clothes, his belonging, and even his name as it's exchanged for a number. Although the prison life wears down 655321, we still see glimpses of the Alex within. His individual spirit is what enables him to secure the opportunity for the Ludovico treatment, as he speaks out to the Minister of the Interior when no one else would dare do the same. The governor chooses him for this fact. In what ensues, we see countless examples of what sets Alex apart from the rest of the characters. The governor, the doctors, the Hitler-esque prison guard, and the writer all display their cynical callousness. The primary difference between them and Alex is that they all have abstract moral shields to cower behind. They all display the rage, anger, and contempt that comes along with a repressed shadow. The governor and the doctors, although differing in methods, are not concerned about genuine reformation, only punishment and suppression of the misguided. The governor, a man of major political influence, states his belief in an eye for an eye. The prison guard uses a murky sense of justice to justify his contempt for Alex, and the writer, although driven by the survival of liberty in his work, immediately caves to that eye for an eye doctrine. It's generally accepted that the film is a dystopia of sorts, although that aspect isn't closely explored. However, I believe that we can view the dystopia in A Clockwork Orange as excessive state intervention on the individual. The problem with that is the fact that Alex is such a vile person, but for a moment let's view the story with a purely allegorical lens. Alex, being a murderer, presents the most obvious and extreme case of a social undesirable. He is simultaneously a pariah and a threat to the rest of the tribe. But surely such a society with the moral inclination to shun such a person is also one with the moral inclination to help such a person back onto their feet so that they may be worthy of participating in society once again. Therefore, the state must intervene. Some have suggested that the state in A Clockwork Orange is a totalitarian one, and there's evidence that there may be one brewing, and we see that in the governor, but not quite yet, as the Ludovico treatment is pushed as a potential cure to crime so that the current administration can secure the votes to remain in power. Many of the characters may be well-intentioned, or at least started off that way, but are utterly incompetent. And in their incompetence and pandering for votes, they allow a treatment that is less of a cure and more of a shortcut, conflating the physical inability to commit crime with the moral decision to choose the good over the bad. The symbiosis of repressed shadows and state incompetence is what makes the dystopia effective.
Here's the punishment element, perhaps. Governor ought to be pleased.
Through the treatment, Alex clings on to his individual spirit, only conceding that his actions were wrong and against society when Beethoven was played during the treatment.
You've proved to me that all this ultra-violence and killing is wrong! Wrong and terribly wrong! It's wrong! It's wrong because it's like against society!
But the treatment ultimately succeeded in crushing Alex's spirit, and his reintegration into society was one of debasement and embarrassment, effectively licking the boot of the state in exchange for handicapped freedom. If that doesn't speak towards a collective repressed shadow, I'm not sure what does. To quote Carl Jung himself, "There can be no doubt that man is less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. The aggressive tendency is mostly repressed by the society of A Clockwork Orange, punished uniformly and certainly not understood. If we wish to reform someone that society deems to be undesirable, we must not come to view them as a number or a vicious hoodlum, but as a human being, an individual. The state wasn't interested in genuine reformation because it's extremely difficult work. It's difficult not only to reform someone else, but to recognize and integrate the shadow within yourself. After all, when you're forced to look within yourself, there's always the risk that you might not like what looks back at you. But as Jung says, if you are conscious of your shadow traits, there is always the chance to correct it. What should frighten us more than becoming acquainted with our darker side is the kind of person we may turn out to unknowingly become if our shadow were to grow out of control. Somewhat ironically, it was Alex's love of Beethoven that brought about his cure. It was used against him and drove him to a suicide attempt, an attempt that reversed the Ludovico effects and encouraged the state to tolerate his individualism out of a pure political convenience. In a sense, we can identify with Alex's imprisonment and torture because we've all been on the receiving end of someone's unchecked anger, hatred, or resentment. Think of times when you were shouted at, scolded by a school teacher, or having an argument with a stranger on the internet. We understand what it's like to be subjected to the lashing out of a repressed shadow. When we watch A Clockwork Orange, it's very tempting to identify with the politicians, the guards, and the doctors around Alex, and in a way we should, but not from a moral standpoint. I would argue that Alex may be more of a victim of the society he lives in rather than a natural exception to its moral principles. If we have unexplored shadows, or a suppressed anger whose source is mysterious and unknown, we should become motivated towards self-reflection, so that we do not become like the periphery characters in the film, angry and full of contempt. Needless to say, those are not ingredients to a happy life. After all, what I believe draws people to Kubrick's film is not a wicked enjoyment of the violence, but rather a character that is truly oneself, an attribute that we all strive for.